It is the early hours of the morning on May 29, 1914. On the St. Lawrence River, a massive fog had rolled in, making it impossible for ships sailing on the river to see ahead of their vessels. Now, on this particular night, a steamship named the Empress of Ireland was heading out to the Atlantic, bound for the city of Liverpool from Quebec City, Canada. Then, suddenly and without warning, the lights of another ship appeared on the horizon. It quickly became apparent to those on the Empress that this ship wasn't just sailing past the Empress of Ireland. In fact, the ship was heading straight for it. The captain of the Empress attempted to maneuver his vessel out of the way, but it was already too late. What was about to happen couldn't be avoided, and it was about to cost the lives of most of those on board the Empress of Ireland. The story of the Empress of Ireland begins many years before the vessel was even built. You see, in the late 1800s, going into the early 1900s, there was a huge demand from immigrants that were wanting to immigrate from Europe over to the North American continent. Now, many of these immigrants, well, they weren't all heading over to the United States of America. Canada was also offering a ton of immigration opportunities to these people. So there were a lot of people that were wanting to immigrate from Europe over to Canada, and steamship companies were more than happy to help accommodate this. However, there was one company that was based out of Canada that wanted to take advantage of this very lucrative business, and that company was the Canadian Pacific Railway. Now, the Canadian Pacific Railway was, to be frank, an incredible company. It grew in such a short amount of time, and you'll quickly see what I'm talking about. You see, they began in the early 1880s with just trying to expand Canada's rail network out of Ontario. However, by 1886, they had built a railway line that went from one end of the North American continent to the other, making it possible for those who live there to travel the entire continent in just 6 days, a journey that would have taken weeks or months before they finished the railroad line. However, this isn't where the Canadian Pacific Railway's ambitions ended. They wanted to become a massive global transportation company, making it possible for someone to travel the entire world and never have to step off a vehicle that was controlled by the Canadian Pacific Railway. And this would count both trains and, hopefully very soon, ocean liners. So, with these ambitions in mind, the next step for the Canadian Pacific Railway was to negotiate a deal with the British government to allow them to have a piece of this very lucrative business opportunity. Once they had that, they then began to look for a steamship company that they could purchase in order for them to have a quick way to enter this business without them having to build a bunch of ships. They eventually found it. In February of 1903, they purchased a company called Elder Dempster & Co., through which they got 3 ships from one of its subsidiaries called the Beaver Line. These 3 ships were the Lake Champlain, the Lake Erie, and the Lake Manitoba. Now, these ships were not super luxurious ocean liners by any means. They were comfortable enough, but the thing about these ships is they focused just as much on transporting cargo as they did passengers. They weren't built with 100% passenger luxury in mind. But these ships were still very profitable and very popular with the public. They offered a quick and safe way to cross the Atlantic, which is what immigrants wanted. However, the Canadian Pacific Railway wasn't satisfied with this. They had seen the success that the big lines like White Star and Cunard Line had had with, the millionaires and high society, and also with immigrants. You got to remember, those companies offered very comfortable accommodations for immigrants. So, with this in mind, they then began to plan to build 2 brand new revolutionary ocean liners that would help put the Canadian Pacific Railway up there with some of the big companies in this industry. Now, work would begin on these 2 brand new ocean liners in early 1904. They were built by Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering in Glasgow, Scotland. Now, both of these ships were designed by a man named Francis Elgar and were designed to be twin screw liners with a top speed of roughly 18 knots. Both ships would be nearly identical in appearance, both having 2 funnels and 2 masts, and they would carry around 1,500 or so passengers. Now, they were originally going to name these 2 ships the Empress of Germany and the Empress of Austria. However, while these ships were being built, they eventually decided to change the names of these 2 ships to the Empress of Britain and the Empress of Ireland. The Empress of Ireland's keel was officially laid down on April 10, 1905, right alongside her sister ship, the Empress of Britain. Now, the Empress of Ireland would be propelled through the water by using two quadruple expansion steam engines, and with both of these engines combined, the ship would have plenty of power to reach her top speed of 18 knots without question. Now, the ship's interiors were going to be the most luxurious that they could do. The Canadian Pacific Railway was really trying to fulfill their dream of having the Empress of Ireland and the Empress of Britain be up there with some of the most luxurious ocean liners around during the time. Now, safety-wise, the Empress of Ireland and Empress of Britain were also state-of-the-art. The ships would have 10 watertight bulkheads that stretched out throughout the entire length of the ship, and these would make 11 individual watertight compartments. Now, the Empress of Ireland could remain afloat if any two adjacent watertight compartments were breached, so this was a fantastic safety feature for the ship. However, the ship's watertight doors, unlike other ships like the Lusitania and the Titanic, the Empress of Ireland's watertight doors had no electric closing doors. All of the doors on Empress of Ireland would have to be closed manually by hand. And while this does sound like a bit of a limitation, and it is, but more on that here in a second, if you have a well-trained crew, you would be able to close all of those watertight doors in as little as 3 minutes, thus keeping the ship from sinking. However, while this does sound very good, well, closing all these doors in 3 minutes in a drill scenario is very different than trying to close these doors in an actual emergency. And this would have serious consequences in the disaster to come. Now, one very surprising thing I did discover when I was researching both the Empress of Britain and the Empress of Ireland was the fact that when the Canadian Pacific Railway was building these ships, they actually planned, pre-Titanic mind you, that these ships would operate with enough lifeboats to have more than enough capacity for everyone on board. That is basically unheard of for this time period. You see, what a lot of people don't understand, the Titanic was not special in regards to the fact that it didn't carry enough lifeboats for everybody on board. So many people like to say that it didn't because everybody thought it was unsinkable or they had some religious faith in the ship or something like that. But that's total nonsense. No ships carried enough lifeboats for everybody on board at this time period, with the exception being the Empress of Britain and the Empress of Ireland. That really does show how much the Canadian Pacific Railway was committed to making these ships as safe as possible. From what I found, the Empress of Ireland and Empress of Britain, their lifeboats had around 200 seats more than the total carrying capacity for these ships. Pretty crazy when you think about it, especially for something that was around pre-Titanic. Now, Empress of Ireland's accommodations, just like all other ships during this time period, were divided up into classes. You had first class, second class. Oh, did you think I was going to say third class? Well, that's not quite right. You see, Empress of Ireland didn't have a third class to say. It actually had something called new and old steerage. And both of these classes were made for immigrants. However, there were some slight different perk accommodations. Now, the old steerage, this basically was the lowest level accommodations on the Empress of Ireland. You didn't have a private room or anything like that. You just basically had a bunk bed in a general or common area. However, new steerage, which would eventually become known as the third class that the Titanic, the Olympic, and other ships would use, well, it offered additional perks, one such being a private room. Now, when I use the word private room kind of loosely, you did have your own dedicated room on the ship, but you would share it with other people. But still, it was more private than if you just had a bunk in like a general or common area. Now, the Empress of Britain's hull was finished shortly before the Empress of Ireland. The Empress of Britain was launched on November 11th, 1905. However, her sister ship, Empress of Ireland, would join her soon after, officially being launched on January 27th, 1906. Now, when both of these vessels were completed, it's safe to say that the Canadian Pacific Railway was very pleased with the work that went into these two brand new revolutionary ocean liners. And they hoped that when these vessels were done and they entered service, it would really put Canadian Pacific Railway on the map as the best way to travel between Europe and Canada. The Empress of Ireland's maiden voyage would occur on June 29, 1906. She departed Liverpool bound for Quebec City, Canada. Now, the ship would make a brief stop in a town called Moville, located in Ireland, the following day to pick up more passengers. And let me tell you, if Canadian Pacific Railway was hoping the Empress of Ireland would be popular, well, believe it or not, they got their wish. While first and second class on Empress of Ireland had a lot of people in them, steerage class was actually overbooked. Both new and old steerage were booked over capacity. In fact, it was so overbooked that the ship had to leave around 100 people behind for its maiden voyage, and they were picked up and brought over to Canada on other ships. So yeah, I think it's safe to say Canadian Pacific Railway got their wish. The Empress of Ireland was indeed going to be one of the public's favorite ways to travel from Europe to Canada. Now, over the course of the next 8 years, life was pretty uneventful for the Empress of Ireland. The ship continued to be a popular choice for those looking to travel between Europe and Canada, and yeah, life was pretty much routine, and I mean, for a passenger ship, that's a good thing, right? Now, following the Titanic disaster, not much had to change with the Empress of Ireland. You know, as I previously stated, the ship already had more than enough lifeboats on board for everyone. And this was something the Canadian Pacific Railway was eager to point out following the Titanic disaster. While other companies like White Star and Cunard were scrambling to put enough lifeboats for everybody on board on all of their ships, the Canadian Pacific Railway was like, guess what, guys? We had that all along. So you know which steamship company to sail with, right? Right? That's my paraphrase version of what they might have done. Now, there was, in fact, one pretty big new safety feature added to the Empress of Ireland following the Titanic disaster, and that was a Marconi wireless set. Yeah, I was surprised to discover that the Empress of Ireland did not have one of these pre-Titanic, and I found that really hard to believe, but apparently that was the case. Anyway, for the next couple of years, life would continue as normal for the Empress of Ireland. In fact, she may have seen a bit of a boost in her sales due to the fact that the Canadian Pacific Railway was really promoting that their ships had enough lifeboats for everybody on board following Titanic, so I'm sure that helped out a bit. However, what everyone at the Canadian Pacific Railway did not know was that the Empress of Ireland was on borrowed time, and that in the year 1914, their favorite ocean liner would soon be at the bottom of the St. Lawrence River. The Empress of Ireland's final voyage began on May 28, 1914. She was once again bound for the city of Liverpool from Quebec City, Canada. Now, on this particular voyage, the ship was around 2/3 full, give or take. She had 1,057 passengers and a little over 400 crew members. Now, it's also important to note that shortly before this voyage, the Empress of Ireland had just gotten a new captain. Yes, the ship's new captain was a man by the name of Henry George Kendall, and he was actually pretty famous with the Canadian Pacific Railway. He kind of had a similar status to what Captain Smith did with the White Star Line. Now, Captain Kendall joined the Canadian Pacific Railway in the year 1910. However, by this time, he already had a great deal of experience working with ships. You see, he began working with ocean liners in the year 1888, when he was the grand old age of just 14 years old. Crazy, right? Then, in the year 1900, he actually survived his very first shipwreck. It was on a ship called the SS Lusitania, not to be confused with the Cunard liner Lusitania that was torpedoed and sunk in May of 1915. That vessel had not been built yet. But after this happened, he continued to work on ships, and he would actually go on to work with Mr. Marconi himself in helping develop ship-to-land communication. Isn't that crazy? He played a huge role in the development of this technology. And then a short time later, he would then use this technology in what I believe is the first instance of something like this actually happening. Well, he would use a Marconi wireless set while he was on board an ocean liner to catch a murderer who was trying to flee from England to Canada. It was a murderer by the name of Holly Crippen. I hope I said that name right. But yeah, he noticed that he was trying to sneak across the Atlantic on his ship, so he got on the ship's Marconi wireless set and contacted England and told them, hey, this guy is on my ship. And they were able to get the police over to the ship, his ship's next port of call, and intercept this murderer after his vessel arrived. Absolutely insane stuff. Listen, Captain Kendall was famous for a reason. Now, jumping back to the Empress of Ireland, this was actually Captain Kendall's first time in navigating the Empress of Ireland from Quebec City down the St. Lawrence River and heading back out into the open waters of the Atlantic. He had just joined the Empress of Ireland a month earlier while the ship was back over in Europe. So yeah, he was still more or less brand new to his vessel, and he was taking his time trying to get, used to his new ship. Basically like getting used to a new car, he was just being cautious. Anyway, the Empress of Ireland departed Quebec City at 4:30 p.m. to a lot of fanfare. What you have to understand is ship departures were pretty big events during this time. There would be music playing, crowds cheering. I mean, it was a big deal to watch these big, beautiful ships coming and going. Anyway, the Empress of Ireland departed Quebec City without incident, and once she was clear of the pier, Captain Kendall engaged the Empress's engines and took her out into the river, hoping that the voyage ahead would be a smooth one. Now, for the rest of the day, as the Empress of Ireland continued to sail down the St. Lawrence River, the new passengers that had just joined the ship were taking their time trying to get accustomed to what was basically going to be their new home for the next week or so. They were checking out their cabins, they were exploring the ship, maybe enjoying some of the delicious food that was served on board, just, the usual stuff that people do when they go somewhere new for the first time. I do that myself. Anyway, at some point after sunset, a fog began to move in on the St. Lawrence River. Now, this wasn't an uncommon occurrence at all. Fogs are fairly common on the St. Lawrence, and ship captains, like Captain Kendall, knew how to handle them. Now, at 1:30 a.m., the Empress of Ireland reached Father Point. It was here where a small tender boat came out to meet the Empress of Ireland, and the ship's harbor pilot disembarked. It was also here where the Empress of Ireland dropped off and picked up some last-minute cargo, more specifically it was mail, bound for Europe. Once this was complete, the tender boat left the Empress, and then Captain Kendall, who was on the bridge the entire time this was going on, he was keeping a sharp eye out on this entire ordeal. Well, he re-engaged the Empress of Ireland's engines, and the ship steamed back out into the St. Lawrence River. However, what those on the little tender boat that at this point could clearly see the Empress of Ireland leaving behind them is that this would be the very last time that any of those would see the Empress of Ireland above the surface of the river. All right, everybody, I hate to do this, but that concludes part 1 in the Empress of Ireland series. Make sure you tune into part 2 when we cover the full sinking of the Empress of Ireland. Thank you guys so much for all your support. If you're new here, please subscribe to the channel and be sure you smash that like button. It really helps out a lot. You all take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Special thanks to my captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.